So I'd just like now to make some introductions. So we have with us from FEDIP, Sarah Scriven, who is the head of operations at FEDIP. Thanks very much for organising this event today with us, Sarah. We also have John O'Connell, who's the Director of Strategic and Service Innovation at South Central and West CSU. So welcome, John. I'll just do a bit of a potted biography. So John is responsible for leading the development of SCW's approach to digital innovation, and also for leading the development and delivery of DDAT programs to support the ICSs in their area in optimizing patient care and delivery. His background is commercial, business intelligence and digital. He's worked in industry in the past, and he's also had the privilege to travel and to experience at first hand, as well as to see, international health and care delivery. He works collaboratively with senior leaders across the NHS to constructively challenge and disrupt through cautious experimentation. That's interesting, perhaps hear more about that later, to agree and define new methods and business models to ensure digital innovations are safely implemented within SCW's ways of working. And John's going to be talking to us about the initial steps and making decisions around implementing and investing in AI. I'd also like to introduce, thanks, John. I'd also like to introduce Ridian Bramley, who is a consultant radiologist with the Christie NHS Foundation Trust. He's also diagnostic, digital and innovation clinical lead with the Greater Manchester Cancer Alliance, leading on projects involving PACS and artificial intelligence. And he'll be talking about the implementation work that he's been doing across the Greater Manchester Cancer Alliance footprint. So we're going to start with presentations, first of all from John and then from Ridian. We'll follow up with a discussion around some of the sort of key points that they've covered in their presentations, and then there's going to be time at the end for Q&A. We hope that you'll find this webinar interesting and informative, and it'll give you some insights and tips for implementing or making decisions around implementation of AI in your own organisation. So without more ado, on to John now to talk about key management practices.
Thanks. You, Jan. Thank you. Can you see the presentation, Jan? Has that come through?
That's come through. Yep, that's fine. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for the great opportunity to speak to everybody. What I wanted to do was to talk about the 5 key management practices for AI-driven AI transformation. We know AI is it's everywhere. It's augmenting everything we do from a human perspective. So what I wanted to do on this is really just share with you some of the useful management practices that we at SCW are looking to implement and actually actively using at the moment. So the first one is just to sort of a bit of context, really, just to say that just to sort of set the scene a little bit. This slide is just putting that we know that technology is a threat, but it's also an amazing opportunity. It's changing the way we work. The world is changing at a rapid pace, and just to help illustrate this, you'll have all heard about the rapid sort of pace and the rise of large language models such as ChatGPT and its meteoric growth. The chart on the right, as you can see there, just gives you an idea of the speed of change that we're looking at. You know, AI ChatGPT took only 5 days to reach 1 million users, you know, whereas Twitter, I believe, took around about 2 years to reach that same sort of audience. So there's a growing demand because of this acceleration for individuals and skills specifically around AI development, around data engineering, around data analysis and machine learning. So there's a need for all of us to sort of remain relevant and to look at these skills. But what did it mean for businesses and organizations such as ourselves? There's kind of three key themes there. Is like, think like a business. AI is no different to any other technology, but we need to act with the end user in mind, front and center. So when you're doing anything with AI, always what is the end user goal that you're trying to achieve, and don't make it a technical or statistical black hole for people that they don't understand. That's the sort of first thing I take away from that. The second thing to think about, platforms and ecosystems. These are really the foundations that you need to connect infrastructure and support systems. We've all heard from the NHS perspective specifically around the federated data platform. But just to say as well, with that, no one size fits all. So you need to understand to have that ability to be able to have like cloud lake houses and what are classed as composable infrastructure to connect data, to connect machine learning models, and to connect data visualization. And then the third one, for me, perhaps is the most important one, is don't forget the humans. We really need a human element. People need who understand the NHS from an NHS perspective need to remain front and center. They know where AI would add the most value. So you can ask a question of AI and you get an answer, but is that answer correct? So you need to make sure that the humans are in the middle of all that. But I thought that was just a really interesting context to help set the scene. So what are the five components that you need to think about? So leading companies who successfully use AI use these kind of five processes. And this was developed from two chaps called Paul Doherty and Hugh Wilson from Accenture. They basically said that because of AI introduces different ways of working, we need a new leadership and new management model. And to dispel the myth between it's either a human role or a machine role, because we're not fighting for each other's jobs, we need to work together. So these are the five areas they said we need to look at: a different mindset, experimentation, leadership, data, and skills. So I'll go through each one of these in order, but they're really important things, I think, for framing the cultural change that's needed to sort of get the value from AI. So the first one of these is on the Mills framework is mindset. And mindset is all about imagining processes, what might be, not what you have today, but what could they be with the new power that you have with AI that it gives you. So executive managers, leaders need to adopt a proper mindset with a focus on not just improving the business process they have today, but completely reimagine what they could be doing in the future and the way work is delivered. So discover, describe, co-create with people in your health system as such. And from us is to move away from rigid work, such as everything being fixed, to smart machines. So work changes as the demands change, and to continuously adapt on the fly. AI gives us that ability to do that. And focus, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is that on that human machine collaboration. And that for us is probably one of the hardest bit and the most important bit. And this is where it brings in a second piece. There's something called the missing middle. And the missing middle, basically, it terms about, machines are great at things, humans are great at things, but these new roles that we need to create, what do they kind of look like? So on this model here, you've got activities that we do that are human only. You've got activities which are machine only. But the exciting area for our workforce is what are the roles that humans add value to machines, but equally, what are the roles that machines can give humans? Superpowers of prediction. Humans are great at judgment. So I encourage everybody to sort of, when they think about new roles, think about these new roles as a combination of the two, really. And we at SCW are beginning to explore these areas using the missing middle model, just to enhance and create new jobs, to deliver unique economic benefit to our economies that we work with, and to create new forms of value. But I think it's a really interesting model when you look at the sort of workforce roles that have to sort of come for the future. The second one is experimentation. This is quite a challenge for the NHS. It's about experimenting. We need to foster a real culture of AI experimentation, trial and error, fail fast culture, and quickly realize how the technology can help us improve. We need to build new models, measure them, and then learn from them. But it must be done sensibly. And what I mean by sensibly from this perspective is AI from an NHS perspective. We are a huge employer, but AI will consume something around about 3.5, they reckon, to 5% of the world's electricity. And as we look towards net zero, we've got to be really considerate. And there's been some maverick research that's been done by Gartner that suggests that when you develop machine learning models, don't keep pushing them to get to 100%, get to around about 70%. That's good enough, because you get diminishing returns, and turn your model off and save server time. So again, it's an interesting area to look at, but push hard on the experimentation and that area there. The next area to focus on is leadership. And this is calling on leaders to, imagine a blended culture of both people and machines, not one or the other, which is really interesting. But leaders must exercise what we class as responsible AI. The most important thing is ensuring that they've got ethical, moral, and legal implications covered with the technology that they deploy. And also consider the societal consequences of anything that they do. Is there bias in anything that they're producing some outputs from? They must also ensure they put the guardrails and use what we class as human checkpoints to test the outcomes that come from the models and the analysis that they do as well. So it's a really, really important area there to sort of invest in. The next area then to think about is data, a big area. But executives and leaders need to recognize that the data is not just about sort of structured data. It's going to be semi-structured data and unstructured data. And think dynamically about what they're going to do differently. Also to think that data needs to be unhindered, and don't try to sort of move data from one area to another. Think about zero ETL, extract, translate, load. And I always think the new skills are going to be needed around how to extract value from the data, which is a really, really important thing to do. But I always try and work to the maximum that don't try and find a purpose for the data that you have. Try and find data for the purpose that you're trying to solve. It's so tempting to start with the data first, but it's much more powerful to think about the problem that you're starting with first. That's probably one of the most important things I think for AI as such. So yeah, new skills for data extraction are going to be needed. And data is going to be come unhindered from a movement perspective. And then moving into the skills, which is kind of probably the last area to sort of really think about, but one of the most important areas. These are kind of 8 skills that came through that need to be developed. They call them 8 fusion skills. And I could go into a lot more on these outside of this call here, but just to take sort of 3, for example, humanizing time. We know from an NHS perspective, a lot of clinicians spend a lot of time on PCs, a lot of time manually inputting stuff. AI and automation can help with that. Automation is a very low-grade AI, but it creates a huge amount of value. But we can give clinicians and nurses some time back to have the time to focus on interpersonal skills with patients as such, and also to give more time back on creativity and decision making. The 4th one, just have a look at there, intelligent interrogation. Knowing how to ask the best questions of AI, I think is one of the most important things. We can ask lots of questions, but make sure that we have some good training on that about how to ask the right questions. And then the final one, the 3rd one for me is skill number 8 there, relentless reimagining. And this comes about, as I mentioned it all the way through this, is looking at creating new processes rather than automating or fixing the processes you have today. Think about how it can be done differently from end to end. And from our perspective, we're focusing on a lot of other skills, which things like data science, machine learning, deep learning, but also 2 big areas I think is really, really key here is to think about critical thinking and curiosity, because this is changing, as I mentioned at the very beginning, with ChatGPT and generative AI. It's moving at such a pace. You need to always keep sharpening that sword as such. And then finally, the last takeaway here, I think we're nearly on my 10 minutes, is just to say, how do we apply this? This is a really interesting canvas. It's called the AI Canvas for developing AI opportunities. And it was developed by 2 chaps or 3 chaps, AJ Agro, Josh Gaines, and I have Goldfrapp. They developed this when you're putting together a proposition for AI. How do you make a case? So the top 4 boxes, and this is a case example for moderation in procurement. When we moderate bids, we spend an awful lot of time scoring bids. Some people score a 3, some people score a 4, some people score a 2, and it's trying to do that, how you get equity in that. Now, what this model works like, the first bit is you look at the prediction. You say, what do you need to know about to make your decision? So you answer what that is. The second one is on the judgment side, is how do you know the value, different outcomes and errors? Then you move through the action. What are you trying to do? And then the outcome is, what are your metrics for successful tasks? Now, once you've agreed all those 4, which can spend some time with the team involved with, you then move to the bottom 3 boxes, which you look at your inputs. What's the data you need to support that predictive algorithm? Then the second box is kind of the training. What data do you need to train the predictive algorithm? And then finally, the feedback you need, because you need to improve that model. As soon as it's released, it's out of sync as such. So how can you improve that? So we use that model as a starter for 5. It's a really good, the AI canvas here that I'm sort of sharing with you is really designed around the autonomy of a decision. After all, AI has only given us more prediction faster and better and lowers the cost of prediction, but the judgment piece needs to be with a human. So it's really important to factor in judgment, but we find this a really, really helpful tool. So I'll kind of finish off there, but thank you for the time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. That was brilliant. I mean, I think we could have had a whole session covering just both of those elements. It was really interesting to hear about Mel's and the approach to AI procurement. As I said earlier, there's an opportunity for Q&A at the end. If you have questions you want to put into chat now, that's great. And we will come back to those later on during the webinar. But thanks very much, John.
Okay.
I'd like to move on to Ridian now, who's going to talk to us about the experience in the Greater Manchester Cancer Alliance of implementing AI and PACS. So thanks, Ridian.
Thank you, Jan. I'll just share my screen. Bear with me a moment while I get the presentation mode up. Can you just confirm you can see those slides?
Yes. Yep.
Great, thank you. So I'm Ridian Bramley. I'm a doctor. I work at the Christie in Manchester as a consultant radiologist with the NHS. I'm full-time doing that, reporting scans during the days. But I also have a role in digital innovation and a real interest in diagnostics and AI. And I've been involved in some projects in this area in digital imaging and PACS. So I just thought I'd share some of that experience today. So some of you may remember this. It's Geoffrey Hinton, one of the godfathers of AI. He was giving a talk up in Scotland back in 2016, I think, and he came up with, he said this, which was controversial at the time. And the particularly controversial bit, as you can imagine, is this, where he said people should stop training radiologists now. It's just completely obvious that in 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists. Now, certainly is controversial. I heard a lot of NHS leaders talking about this at the time and ministers, and you do wonder what effect this sort of comment had at the time. I mean, if you ask ChatGPT about this, I think it's very diplomatic. It says that actually he was being deliberately provocative at the time to raise debate, which I think is fair about that. And we do see really not AI replacing radiologists. We see it as the word often used is augmentation, is it? Augmenting and supporting radiologist skills. I mean, certainly if we look now, we're now in 2023, we have still got very limited uptake of diagnostic imaging in AI, and certainly we have got no autonomous diagnostic AI in practice. There's no shortage of suppliers out there on the Crown Commercial Framework, which is being used for the AI Diagnostic Fund now, which is putting diagnostics and AI. There's over 75 suppliers listed, very keen to sell their services to the NHS. So there's certainly a need for AI. This is the diagnostic waiting times. Actually, this is the number of patients waiting and how this has changed back from the last decade all the way up. So we've got a real problem. We've got record numbers of patients waiting, and this is partly the catalyst for the National AI Diagnostic Fund. Is they're very keen to bring in whatever we can technologies to help address some of this waiting list before the winter backlog that's going to come, the winter pressures. But this is not just all about waiting times. I mean, this is actually having an impact on patients. I mean, clearly patient experience, but also outcomes. So, for example, lung cancer, where I'm working with, at the moment, we have some of the worst outcomes in the developed world and in Europe, and a lot of that is felt to be due to these delays in diagnosis that we have, with resulting in patients presenting at a later stage. We know, for example, from studies that even if we save 2 weeks off this diagnostic pathway, it can give patients an extra 6 months of life, which is equivalent to some courses of chemotherapy. So it's very important that we can address this if we can. So NHS England is interested, but so is the college. So our professional body is really interested to try and get AI to help us address these particular challenges. And they organised an expert stakeholder day towards the end of last year. And that involved experts from NHS England, from the profession, and they invited mainly suppliers on to share their experience. And they also surveyed them before and said, what are your 3 main barriers to getting your AI adopted in the NHS? And this is what they came up with. So this is all the answers. So 23% of the answers were the top one, lack of evidence. That doesn't mean 23% of suppliers said it. That was the total answers. But it's the top one. And it's quite telling, really, that this is the actual industry that are selling this to the NHS, saying the main barrier is that we haven't got the evidence that it works. And I feel for them as well, because it is a bit of a catch-22. It's a vicious circle in that to get the evidence, you need people to adopt it, for the evidence of real-world practice. And for that, you need funding. And NICE are there to help advise us on this. And NICE produced guidance on chest X-ray AI, and that was only in the last 2 weeks. And they said the evidence isn't there. And they said core NHS funding should not, at the moment, be spent on AI in this area. It said there's certainly opportunity, and we need to do create further evidence in here, but it said it should be limited to either industry-funded or research or innovation studies. So that's where we're looking for funding. So if you've got over those particular barriers, you have actually got funding and you've got a project. I mean, these other barriers are real. So if we look at another chest X-ray AI project that's been doing the group, David Baldwin's leading on that. And this is looking at whether, again, it can improve turnaround times. Now, that project is way behind. I was speaking with David only this week, and the main barrier he has experienced, extremely frustrating this is information governance. And there is a lot of bureaucracy, as you know, at the moment around information governance, but also a lot of inconsistency and variability on how it's approved by each of the organisations that you're engaged with. So that is, we know, a challenge that we really want to try and address, and that was one of the college recommendations. In my own experience of engaging, because I do innovation as well as just AI, a lot of it is trying to engage with the system and working out what we can do. And certainly staff capacity is one of the big ones for me. And that's not just that we're all really working hard in the area that we're doing and people haven't got the time. It's also because to generate the evidence, you're often doing something at odds with what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, a breast AI project that's been funded through the National AI funding, the protocol around that, so just for breast screening, what the normal practice is, you have 2 radiologists that read each radiograph to get the right level of accuracy. So it's an ideal situation where AI can come in and replace, as an early start, one of those humans. We just need to show it's as accurate. But to get there, the study has been set up, and this is with breast AI being around a long time, the study has been set up so you have to still have the 2 humans reading it as they normally do, then the breast AI reads it, and then the humans have to reread any discrepancies again and score them. So if we're asking the system to engage with this, we're asking them to put in extra hours of meetings every week to try and actually evaluate and validate this AI. And we managed to get one hospital to agree to do it, but most of the systems said, look, we can't do it. Even with extra funding, we just have not got the staff to do this. And that is trying to construct studies is one of the problems that can actually be done on a hard-pressed system. Now, part of the reason I was there, and I'm at the back here, is that we did conduct a study in Manchester, and it's recognised as one of the few studies that we actually implemented AI, clinical AI, across a whole integrated care system. So 3 million population. For us, this is 7 major acute trusts, 14 hospitals. And the other thing that we're asked to talk about is we did this and technically enabled it and did it in just a few months. People want to know how we did that. And I gave a talk on this at the AI Imaging Congress in Liverpool in the summer. And when I was doing that, the speaker went after me. He made a very amusing remark at the beginning, because he said, I've just been listening to Manchester, and with their AI skateboard, it feels like they've been skateboarding on concrete. And he says, in my own experience, my own projects in the last 2 years, it feels like I've been skateboarding on gravel. And that is a very good analogy of what it's like. And, it helped me reflect back on what we've done in Manchester. And we may not be getting HS2 now, but we certainly laid a lot of concrete and foundations around AI in enabling us to do this. And the way we did that, just to share that experience, is that when we went, we had to go out because we had to replace our PAC system, which is our main imaging system. We all got the same system across Manchester. We all had it separately, but we decided to procure it all together. Now, this is going to be a 20 to 30 million pound procurement, we knew, over 10 years. Big investment. And so the last thing we wanted was to buy something that, again, was stuck with them for 10 years and is not innovating, it's not developing. We've got the innovator's dilemma around this. So a big part of that procurement, 20% of it in terms of scoring, was around AI innovation. We didn't know the answer. We decided to ask industry, part of that procurement process, how are you going to enable us to have access to all of these latest algorithms and be able to evaluate them as part of that process. And the model that we like most, and some of you may be familiar with this, is the concept of the AI platforms. Now, we procured this as part of our project. It was actually the same supplier that provided the AI platform, but many other suppliers do exist. These are vendor neutral in the sense that they can support lots of different applications coming on. The way this works in practice is if you're an AI vendor or supplier, you provide your software under license and it gets uploaded. In practice, that's sort of done as a Docker. You upload it to the secure environment, which is the platform. Now, that's obviously Cyber Essentials accredited. It's got all the assurances around it, but also all the standard integrations for imaging. It's the DICOM, HL7, etc. And that's to ensure it can support pulling the data in that we need to analyze, but also it can put all the information back into the clinical applications that radiologists like me are using to be able to support all the workflow enhancements, prioritization, decision support, etc. And also it collects the data essentially as a secure data environment and can also feed off to other federated secure data environments if you need to. So that was the approach we took. And by doing that, when we deployed the packs, and this was all part of it, we did the data protection impact assessment, DTACs, etc. Because the data controllers are the trusts, we are doing the imaging, but it's the actual providers who are doing the data processing. And there is one data processor doing it. None of this data is shared with the AI providers themselves. It's just all held in a secure environment. So it makes that a lot easier. We've done it in advance. So all we had to do was effectively remind trusts that had already signed up to this, it's done, and turn it on. And again, that's easy as well because it's all cloud-based. There was no requirement for the trust IT departments to actually do anything technically. It's all done in the cloud by the supplier. So that's how we managed to lay the concrete to actually get this in place. But the technical evaluation is only, the technical enabler is only one part of it. So we did have to go through the standard things that we do in the NHS to make the case, the 5-case model that we do around this. And this is all around stakeholder engagement and making the case. I've already shared some of the benefits that we can in the lung pathway. And I think one of the strengths of this is we had lung pathway leads on our lung cancer pathway actually leading this and taking the engagement and taking it out through the groups and giving these presentations about why we need to do this. From a commercial case, this was commercially funded by AstraZeneca, working with the supplier. So we didn't have to generate the money for the AI processing, but it's still a pressure on the system and people have to do it. So we had to make the case and argument to NHS leaders why, of all the myriad of projects they could be doing, why this was one that we wanted them to spend a bit of time and look at. And I think it is actually very difficult to actually do AI projects without putting additional project management and backfill resources in. And most bids that go in will include that. We did it without, which I think is quite amazing. Now, the other thing you need to do when making a case is to say how you're going to evaluate, especially if you're going for innovation and research funds. And so engaging with the college at the moment, we realise there is sort of lack of understanding or a knowledge that needs to be gained from a lot of areas in how to do this. Now, this very helpful paper in the BMJ, I won't spend much time on this, but it compares, which are similar things, which is drug evaluation, surgical innovations that are done, and AI in healthcare. And for what we're doing, really, it's this middle bit here. So the initial evaluations have been done to get all these products CE marked, and we're now doing early live clinical evaluations. And the Decide AI framework, you can Google that, really describes the framework for doing that and how you would write and present the data and the evidence around that. One of the key things, and then pulling back to what John said, is a lot of the work done up here is just to say how it works in isolation, what's the sensitivity, specificity, etc. All of this is how does it work in clinical practice? What is it like, that missing middle, because it is there for decision support and working to aid the clinicians in the environment. There is a real dearth of information, Nigel said, around this, and this is where we need to do it. Now, I'll just finish on just one area on this, looking at those human factors about AI, implementing AI, because this is actually turned out to be our major barrier in implementing our project, as well as something that we needed to evaluate. So just to give you an example, it's nice to show a picture. This is a chest radiograph. If you're not used to looking at these, this is imagine you were looking at the person. This is the heart in the middle, the black things are the lungs either side, and the ribs And we normally just look at these and try and identify abnormalities in the clinical context and report them. Now, we also, with AI, we get an additional image, which is this one where it flags abnormalities for us. It doesn't necessarily make it a diagnosis, it's just flagging things. In this case, it's flagging what it says is a nodule up here. Now, this is actually quite a difficult spot. It's an area where things can often be missed. But in this case, the patient did then go on to have a CT scan that showed a lung cancer. And that could have made a huge difference to that patient's life expectancy and outcome by picking them up earlier, if it influenced the human. Now, in practice, you think that would be great and everyone wants to do this, but when you go and roll it out, you have to think of the other things. Now, what happens, for example, if it didn't flag it, and we know the sensitivity of these AI algorithms is about 90% a lot of the time. So if that 10% where it's not flagging it, does it influence the report to the radiologist? Are they falsely reassured? Have we got patients coming to harm as a result of that? And then, so that's the false negatives and the false positives. I mean, this is a common area where we can get scarring and fibrosis. In fact, the false positive rate, the positive predictive value is relatively low for AI. There's a lot of overcalls, but certainly what we've experienced. And one of the main concerns from radiology departments is this is going to cause not necessarily concern, worry, but also over-investigation on a very hard-pressed radiology department that's trying to manage difficult backlogs. So although this is a key question we want to address, actually when the radiology departments really got into working it out, we didn't really know until we'd implemented it and look at, we run in shadow mode for a while to work out exactly what it's showing. People hadn't realised the potential downsides. And as an NHS, we are very risk averse, and we often look at this and think of, the things that the harm that it can cause and the difficulty in achieving our own performance management as opposed to the benefits. So I think this is a particular problem, and we can discuss this more in discussion that we have to overcome. I won't show. I mean, in practice, AI flags lots of things, and in cases, and I will just very briefly mention this is flagging things like pneumothorax here. And if this is wrong, and this is not a pneumothorax, this is actually a false positive here, and a casualty doctor is looking at this and decides to put a chest drain in here, you could actually kill the patient. And it's examples like this that people were very concerned about, and we had to kind of really slightly restrict down our implementation to the number of people where we had to get training in to support it. So that's the end of my talk. I hope that was useful, just sharing some of our practical experience, and I'm looking forward to exploring some of this more with John in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Riddy. And that was, again, really interesting. And, the real world issues that you've addressed and how you've addressed them has been really, really interesting. I'd like to just sort of ask a few questions now, kind of picking up on key points in the areas that you've covered, and then we'll open up for more general questions. And I'd just like to start with the sort of the decision making around investing in AI, because clearly there's a lot. John, you said it is another technology, but it's a technology, as with any technology in health and care, that needs to be needs to take into account safety, in making that decision. So a question to both of you, I think, about the what would be your sort of your top recommendations for getting your organisation to make a decision around investing in AI? What are your top tips, or what are the things that the organisation needs to be thinking about most critically? Question to both of you.
John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, it's not an easy one. For me, I think three things. I think from our organisation, I think it's really spending time with each of the executives to understand kind of their businesses and the services that they're running, and understand their challenges with them. But it's really important that you come from their perspective first and understand the challenges. Then I think if you are developing a business case or a utility with their teams, is spend some one-to-one time with them just to get them on board and feedback so they're comfortable with it. There's nothing worse, I think, than going to a board meeting and going, da-da, here's something that's quite transformational but brings in a lot of risk. So I and the team, we tend to spend a lot of time with our execs just bringing them up to speed on what this technology is, because people say large language models and it could be, what does it actually mean? So spend time with the exec, that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is to be really clear on the use case and the business problem that you're trying to address with it, and don't be too wide with it. Be quite specific about the challenge. And there's nothing better, I think, rather than having us from an innovation team going in and saying, here's something we want to change the world, is we have the teams who are on the ground doing the work, let them present the problem, say the challenge that they have, and then let them present how they believe the AI and the support of the innovation team is going to help deliver that. So that's the sort of second one. And then the third one I think is really important, is probably, I think, give consideration, because it's very easy. I think it's really intense. You could try and build stuff, but there's amazing platforms out there. So we try and give consideration to kind of three options. I call them the 3 Bs, which is build, buy, or buddy. You know, you could build stuff yourself, which is fine, and it's quite a bit of a steep learning curve. You could buy, someone's already probably been out there and done this. But I think, you know, organizations, the NHS specifically, have got a great community called Analyst X. They've got a GitHub repository. And some of the great work I think that really in this team are doing, there's probably someone that's been there and been on that journey, and they'll share code with you. So have a look at what's out there. So I think, you know, those three things, I think really spend time with your exec leaders and their service lines. Second one, I think just be really clear on the use case and the benefits from it. And then the third one is just explore those build, buy, or buddy with people as well. Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really good top tips. Thank you. And Ridian, did you want to?
Yeah, there's a different perspective on it. I mean, because we're coming from different angles. So I'm a clinical lead, and in my role, I work quite closely with the Academic Health Science Network and their sort of pipeline of innovations coming through, and looking at what's available on the market. And then I work with the Cancer Alliance, where we have pathway boards. These are clinical leads set up, and part of the process is to triage these that they look interesting, and then engage. I'd say bottom up, really. Engaging with the clinical leads in these areas, and say, is this something you think that might be of interest to you? And even if I think it's absolutely of interest, unless I get real buy-in from the clinical lead, you know, from Pathway, from it's leadership, isn't it? Someone that says, actually, I think this is worth looking at, and prepared to engage and put the effort in, then it's not worth doing from my perspective, really. And now part of my role is to try and get that engagement and that buy-in from them. But then work it up from there. And I've just given a presentation on how we implemented something at scale. And because I was involved in our PACS procurement, I was very interested to see if we could implement something at scale. But really, you want to start small, and you want to create that and create the evidence, and then present that evidence out to scale up and out from where you started, I think is the best way to do it. And if you can get champions, particularly those that are working in the coalface, to really say what an impact it's having, and even patients, you know, it's even better, then you're much more likely to convince the execs.
No, that's really, really good, and it actually sort of leads on to another question, which is also sort of coming up in chat, which is about the impact of AI on the frontline workforce, and how to increase the sort of confidence, you know, of those people who are working, radiologists, or, you know, and others that are sort of working in this area, in the you know, in the technology that's being delivered. So, tricky question. Do you want to take this first, Ridian? Again, is that?
Yeah, I can do on this now. It's quite interesting if you engage with the workforce, how you do. I'd like to give examples of particular projects, and well, it doesn't sound very sexy in terms of projects, but it's actually speech recognition. Now, you do wonder, is speech recognition AI? But if you ask ChatGPT and Google Bard, they say it is. So it takes one to know one, and ultimately modern speech recognition is. But that's a project we did over 15 years ago, and I learned a lot from that project in terms of rolling that out, and we used many of the same things. And what are the whole barriers and engaging with the workforce on that? It's the same process that we do for other things. And sometimes when I think of the newer AIs, I think, well, we actually haven't even rolled out speech recognition ever. I actually teach on, I used to teach on this with the university, and I used to spec groups up and give them that particular scenario about how, because we had, when there was this national rollout of PACS and imaging, and on the back of that, just a very small bit, we actually procured the licenses for speech recognition, and we looked 2 years after implementing it, and nobody had deployed it. And the reason is our deployment was to provide each trust with a CD in an envelope, and that was it. And obviously, it takes a lot more to deploy something out with the system. But The approach we took then was to exactly the same thing. We had a limited budget. We started off as enthusiasts at one point, built up the evidence and rolled it out. We had 84% of radiologists then using speech recognition after 1 year by doing that approach. But exactly the same things in terms of workforce engagement coming in. We had radiologists saying right at the outset, look, this is not going to help us. We use digitalization at the moment. Our secretaries type this up. This is very efficient for us. You're asking us to do extra training that's going to take time. You know, these are tasks that we shouldn't be doing, you know, training this voice recognition and actually doing it. This is what our PAs and secretaries are here for. And look at it, the voice recognition is getting it wrong. We know about this. It's not as accurate as our secretaries. Why are you asking us to do this? So it's understanding those, but it's only actually by doing it small scale with enthusiasts you can build up the evidence and convince all these people actually this is something worth looking at. And so I'd sort of share that as one example of how we've done it. John?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, a very good example. Just a bit of probably a low tech. So RPA, robotic process automation, is a low tech AI if you look at it, but it adds an awful lot of value. And coming from that perspective, what we found is kind of bringing the workforce on board as, you know, fear and anxiety comes, I think, from the unknown and not knowing stuff. And people haven't been lucky enough to be immersed, like some of the people on this call and others, in the domain as such. So what we try to do with that, for example, when we're looking at automation and digitizing, is bringing the workforce on that journey with us. So make it as part of a QA program. So what we end up trying to do is there's some amazing QSAR programs the NHS has about, you know, PDSA cycles, plan, do, study, act. So what we try and do is say to the teams themselves, look, you know, we need as the NHS to be providing more value for the taxpayer money that comes through, and more value to our customers. Let's do an improvement process. It just so happens that you put your hand into this toolbox called AI, and there could be something called RPA that you pull out, but get them to start using that and applying it. And it could be that it may be automation, but it also may be something like prediction, maybe a big issue because they've never had so much data before and they might want to use a model. But if they use that AI capability as part of a quality improvement program, it's less that's been done to them. They are part of the process and you get the buy-in. So that was a really key thing. So I think it helps build trust up with our workforce as such.
Yeah. No, that's really, really helpful. I mean, I think one of the messages that you're both saying is around sort of starting small, and there are some questions in chat then about scaling up. And the scaling up from the point of view of, you know, your own organization or across your sort of your patch, but there's also kind of scaling up in terms of making other people aware, you know, and, you know, that knowledge sharing piece. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how we can scale up from these smaller implementations to something more, something that's wider, bigger. So what are your thoughts on that, on the scaling up question?
Shall I
yeah,
that one? Yep.
Thanks.
So from our perspective, we use kind of an innovation process, a 3-stage process, and it's design thinking, lean startup, and then agile development. So from a design thinking perspective, we start with kind of the end user, and it goes back to what is the problem. And it sounds relatively simple, but you know, when you really try and get down to what you're actually trying to do, it's quite a hard and it's a tough skill to sort of form. So we start off with design thinking about what is that problem. It can be big, but narrow it right down to what exactly you're trying to do. And then we move to the second phase, which is kind of what we class as lean startup. It's a really good book by a chap called Eric Ries. And it says that you can build something that can kind of look and act like it would work in the real world. So you don't need to build sophisticated models out, but you could use things like Figma, and you could show the machine model working in the background. And what that tends to do is helps get your executives and others on board with the journey that you're trying to get them on board. Once you then get those gateways through the design thinking, the lean startup, and you get investment, as kind of really has said, we then move to what we class as agile development, which, you know, it's just the way you do kind of software releases, but we do the first development of the model. If it works and the outcomes are fine, we then do another phase. Now, we can kill it as well, because equally the data may be very poor, it may be very biased, and we can decide to sort of kill it at that point because we just don't have the data and we can't clean it. So we use that 3-stage process, but there's also another stage process called double diamond, which is the Design Institute uses, which people may use. But from our perspective, that they're the sort of the stages that we use. The double diamond talks about discovery, definition, development, and then delivery. And the benefit of using, you know, either the 4-stage or the 3-stage process, you go from kind of exploring, we call it kind of what the problem is, to exploiting, but you use agile. But if you take people through that journey, it tends to work for us. But I'd love it to be a lot quicker, but it's very timely. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I'll give two examples. I'll just start with that speech recognition again. The way we did that was to, we only had £10,000 of funding available, and we had to get some consultancy support in terms of getting someone that had actually done it and got experience on it. So what the condition for that trust doing that project was, they had to do a host an event with us afterwards where we shared all that experience with all the other trusts around. And we asked at that event who would like to be next. And we didn't have funding for it, but we went, because of the benefits we showed in the first case, we were able to fund 4 more pilots, all exactly the same condition. But they all held a workshop, everybody came, we shared all the benefits afterwards. And that's how we managed to get up to 84% every year. Because after we'd done 2 cycles of that, the business case was really made and people could see the benefits of rolling it out. Now, in the big project that we just done there, which was I saw as a big project, we had to technically enable the whole platform as one to begin with, which is why it's a big project. But we did have a site go first, and we had everyone, all the sites coming on, to all learn from each other. So, and that was the benefit. So you could take it and cascade that information from one site to the other, which is very effective. But also, as we found, as I showed some of the human factors, if you were one site like raising a risk and saying we've had an incident against this, and we're all concerned, suddenly everybody decides to shut down. So it can be a catalyst and get everyone forward, but it can also shut everybody down if you have delivering it as a very close linked project between everybody.
Great, thank you. I just want to move on to a few of the questions. There are lots of questions, as you might imagine, in chat, and I said right at the start that we'll have a look at the questions after the webinar. Ridgeon and John have kindly agreed to have a look at them and see if we can come back with some answers to ones that we're not able to cover. And I've tried to cover a few as we've sort of gone through. There are some questions around risk, actually, and these are perhaps questions, again, perhaps Ridgeon for you, but the DTAC is the sort of method of assessing risk in clinical systems implementation. And there's a question about, the approach that you would take to AI implementations, and also there's a question specifically about privacy being a sort of consistent theme in terms of risk, whether there's any advice that you would have to offer there. So it's around sort of DTAC approach and specifically around sort of the data privacy. I mean, I know there are obviously sort of lots of issues around that, and we haven't got time to go into loads of detail, but just some thoughts, either of you on DTAC.
So a couple of others around the privacy bit, the IG side. For AI, I mean, if you're accessing it in a clinical application, it's helpful that it's got exactly the same restriction controls as the rest of the clinical application. So it is, patient-sensitive information for that particular episode. So I would caution against setting up your own separate, from clinical perspective, controls. It should be the same controls that you've implemented elsewhere. Obviously, for research and everything, that's a separate question, and we all our data is pseudonymized and put through our secure data environment for that. So the other aspect of the question is around safety, really, because safety is part of your DTAC assessment, your requirement to do these DCB 0129, 0160 clinical safety assessments, part of the Health and Social Care Act. So the way we approach that is if you're doing a project across a number of trusts, we try and do it once and share. I mean, each trust is individually responsible for this, but we try and avoid duplicating where possible. So we did produce a full risk log around the whole project, and there was quite a detailed lot around the conditions of the human factors that I mentioned before, false positives, false negatives, etc., and all the mitigations we considered to put in place to address those. But we had regular clinical forum meetings running all the time, and the main purpose of those was to understand risk and bring it in, update, and try and ensure that everyone's concerns were met and addressed. John?
Great.
no, I'd agree with that. We follow the same process of the DBC 0129, and then we were applying it to organisations of that 0160. But I'd also add in on the risk perspective, just to sort of think about, because from AI, I think there's kind of three big pitfalls just to consider. If outside of the attack, is just to look at kind of privacy, replication, and bias. I think the privacy piece of just looking at, is the information in the algorithm used for prediction or profiling, we very narrow. So really take note of kind of what you can and can't do with it. So consider that. Replication kind of talks to that ability for explainability. It's very much linked in with neural networks and what they produce. This black box, you can put information in, something gets done, and an output comes out, but you need to be able to explain why it's happened. Having a black box isn't kind of best practice, so just be kind of conscious of that. It's been got a lot of challenge, but I think probably the biggest one for the NHS, I don't know what you think about, is probably bias. A lot of our data is kind of very weighted to certain cohorts of a population. So, for example, when you look at cancer, late presentation is usually people from different demographic groups. So if you were building something for an outreach clinic or a sort of testing clinic, you'd probably look at the data and say, well, that's cohort that they don't get cancer, and I can't see them in that signal because the data's not there. It doesn't mean they're not there. It just means they're late presentation. So be really aware of bias, specifically the NHS and the training. And a lot of our data, unfortunately, is biased because people with really bad late stage cancer, stage 4, could come from deprived communities, and they're late. So if you're planning any services and using AI, just think about the gaps in the data that you may have. So they're the only things I'd probably add to that.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you both. I think we're running out of time now in terms of this session, but we have got another session, a joint session with FEDIP planned for the new year. And one of the area that we really wanted to focus on there was the impact on the workforce in terms of skills and training, and ethical considerations around data are obviously important there, and the sort of data analytics skills in that area. So I'd just like to thank John and Ridian very much now for the really interesting presentations, informative presentations, which we'll be sharing the recording from this session after the session, and also for providing some more information through our sort of discussion afterwards. We'll have a look at the questions and see whether we can come back with answers, and the presentations will be on the BCS and the FEDIP website, so you'll be able to see the recording there. So thank you everybody for joining the session today. It's been great to see so many people and such a lot of interest in the chat and discussions going on through chat as well. So thanks very much everybody, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.